and welcome back to the channel. My name is Muriel, and in this video I will be doing my April reading wrap-up. In the month of April, I read a total of 7 books. 2 non-fiction, 2 bound-up short stories, so it technically counts as 1 book, and 4 novels. I will start, as I more or less usually do, with the non-fiction. First, in April, I finished Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, a now considered classic work of socialist, or even Marxist, I suppose, feminist analytical writing. This treatise posits that the witch hunts that took place in Europe and then the American colonies during the early modern period should be read as the climax of the societal misogyny that exploded alongside and as the result of the transition from feudalism to market capitalism. Ms. Federici is, I believe, a socialist and/or Marxist philosopher, and she draws in this book on Marxist philosophical analysis and some historical data to make a case, and weaves in the colonization of the Americas to draw parallels between the exploitation of the emergent working class, or, the proletariat, that of enslaved African and American natives, and the degradation women's societal status underwent as Europe exited the Middle Ages. Hence the title's reference to Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, and its characters. I think this is an interesting thesis, the core idea of which I was already familiar with before picking this book up, and it's also one I agree with to a certain extent, but, yes, there is a but, this book was not written by a historian, and this painfully showed. There are massive issues here with the way the author backs up some of her claims. In fact, some of her bolder claims aren't backed up by source data at all, and misconstrues the available data on the period of history she covers in the book. It really did help that I read Ronald Hutton's The Witch last month, and Max Dashu's book this month, more on that in a few minutes, as that publication, so The Witch, is all about history, written by a very measured but thorough historian. The Witch was also published in 2018 and thus relies on more recent historical research and analysis, whereas this was published in 2004, and I actually think part of the thesis was already written before that. For instance, one should keep in mind that no, the body count for the European witch trials does not go into the several hundreds of thousands. The actual number was still way too high, mind you, given the horrific suffering and irredeemably tragic loss of life the witch trials entailed. Right, but inflating the numbers and barreling through on a current of factual inaccuracy doesn't earn my praise or respect either. The author, as far as I'm concerned, arranged a lot of the data to fit her hypothesis. Again, I think there are nuggets of truth to it. There was, in fact, a broad and steady erosion of women's social status and rights during the early modern period, heretofore misguidedly named the Renaissance, and I'm generally on board to draw parallels between different axes of oppression, as long as temporal and geographical context is taken into account to allow for a more nuanced understanding of the broader patterns involved. I'm also very critical of capitalism as a system and agree major historical shifts often hide ills that we're only now able to perceive through, broadly speaking, scientific inquiry that welcomes different points of view. And not just, the biased perspective of one specific demographic, wink wink. But Miss Federici's treatise runs on a mode of inquiry that isn't scientific enough, in my opinion. The available data was arranged to purposefully to prove or support a pre-embraced hypothesis, and that just doesn't quite sit right with me. Additionally, I was very confused by whether or not the author actually argued that patriarchy wasn't a thing before the advent of capitalism. I'm still not entirely sure about this because the phrasing was a bit vague in places. The organization of the thesis's main sections or arguments could have also used some streamlining, if I'm perfectly honest. Again, yes, some things did in fact become worse for women as Europe exited the Middle Ages, but history is complex. A hodgepodge of crossing threads, reinforcing and colliding factors, and the simple fact is patriarchy didn't magically emerge out of the void in the 15th to the 16th centuries. Like, hello? Now, I don't subscribe to the idea that patriarchy or androcracy is the default state of human society by any means, but it's been bopping about for longer than, 500 to 600 years, and European capitalists aren't solely responsible for its emergence. Due credit wasn't even given to the ancient Greco-Roman world, or the Christian church, really. But like I said, I'm not entirely sure that's even what Miss Federici was ultimately asserting either. So make of that what you will. Still, that's why Caliban in The Witch doesn't get anything higher than a 6 out of 10 from me. It was an interesting read overall, yes, but also a very disappointing and frustrating one that I would furthermore only really recommend if you're specifically interested, like me, in becoming more knowledgeable about the development of feminist theory. Otherwise, not really. After Caliban and the Witch, I dived straight into Max Dashu's Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religion, circa the years 700 to 1100. And I love this! This is exactly the kind of book I wanted to read regarding, well, the pagan and folkloric origins of the witch figure on the one hand, and the survival of pagan and female-centric spirituality in European culture on the other. This overview of the topic is multifaceted and multidisciplinary in a way, though it was still only written by one author and independent researcher is what I'll call Ms. Dashu. That, in and of itself, is really impressive given the scope and depth of scholarship displayed in this book. Now, this volume is the first entry in a projected series dedicated to female-centric history, sociology and religion or spiritual tradition, and centers on female spheres of spiritual power in the early European Middle Ages. Ms. Dashu draws on linguistic evidence, the written historical record, but also oral folk tradition, mythological texts, canonical law, and archaeological evidence. I was specifically impressed by the linguistic analysis she presented in the book, and I may be wrong here, but I believe Ms. Dashu has training in linguistics, maybe? And I found it absolutely fascinating, not to mention immensely stimulating for my mild etymology nerd and pattern-making self. Because yes, I have freaking finally found a book that tackles this topic, one I consider a special interest, or at least one that overlaps several interrelated special interests of mine from different but linked angles, and which relies on drawing patterns of meaning from different sources of evidence. Yes! For real though, this book was fascinating and not at all soapboxy. The author offers up her own interpretation and analysis of the topic, of course, but she follows the evidence, from what I could tell at any rate, and sources everything as well. To temper my enthusiasm a tiny bit, however, I also have to point out I found the book a little dense at times, because, well, there's so much bloody information in here, and structured a little disjointedly. This may actually be by design though, since, once again, I believe from an interview I've read, Max Dashu holds a specific fondness for the concept of webs and matrices of knowledge, which I can honestly respect and even mildly vibe with, but at the end of the day, I guess I do prefer something a bit more linear when it comes to published nonfiction. Still, this was a rock solid 8 to a soft 8.5 out of 10. I would highly recommend it, especially paired with Ronald Hutton's work, honestly, though, as I stated in my previous reading wrap-up concerning the latter's The Witch, this stuff is for nerds, in the best possible way, mind you, but do keep that in mind. Also, now I really want the other volumes in this projected series to come out, but sadly I have absolutely no idea if any of them are even close to being published. Now onto the fiction, and starting with 2 short stories. I read Aliya Whiteley's The Beauty and Peace Pipe. I was only really interested in the former, but my edition was bound up with the latter, and given both are short stories, like I said, I figured I might as well read the 2 of them. I'd previously read Whiteley's Skyward Inn, last year in fact, and even though I didn't enjoy the novel at all, I didn't think it was complete garbage either, and The Beauty's premise specifically seemed interesting enough for me to give Whiteley's writing another go. So the premise for the beauty is as follows. A fungal disease infects women's wombs and kills them off. We all die. An unspecified amount of time later, in a small, isolated, rural community, the remaining men come across mushrooms! Yes! Fungal shenaniganing strikes again, growing out of their female relatives' graves. Shortly after that observation, said shrooms emerge out of the ground, transformed into full-blown shroom women. And said shroom women start humming after the men's hungry for their love. Yes, you heard that right. This story 1000% counts as weird fiction, but beyond the weird, not to mention body horror, this gets pretty gruesome in places factor of, horny mushroom women. And a couple of strange, beat-on-the-nose gender and reproductive role reversals I won't spoil. I didn't really get much here in terms of deeper world-building or theming. Big Sag. Now, lots of readers seem to think there is proper feminist theming here to do with, well, gender and sexual dynamics via horny shroom women. I need to stress that. And sure, I guess I can kind of see the tentative spores of that, but also not really. There was an interesting and certainly original, yes, idea here, but also a rather poor and thus underwhelming execution of said idea, unfortunately. So this, for me, was only a 5 out of 10. Still, an automatic point for the freaky fungal fun, because those are simply the rules at this point. Then there was Peace Pipe, and its premise is as follows. So a woman is quarantined somewhere after a disastrously failed mission involving first contact with sentient beaver and tree-like alien beings, and she starts conversing with a pipe containing what she believes to be a sentient alien water-like being, or something to that general effect, I think, who is also, presumably, quarantined in the same facility. I thought this second short story was marginally better than the beauty, but it wasn't really anything to write home about either. There was some baseline theming on communication, connection, and transcending difference towards a state of undifferentiation. I might be reaching here, but hive minding was definitely a thing in Skyward Inn, which, to repeat, I didn't like, in part precisely because it featured an uncritically positive portrayal of ego loss / hive minding / undifferentiated oneness. And I'm just not about that at all. I hate that trope in science fiction. There was also, as an FYI, just the merest hint of that idea in the beauty as well. Overall, I guess Peace Pipe was just fine. Hence the slightly higher 6 out of 10 rating I gave it. Regardless, I think I'm pretty much done with Whiteley's writing, honestly. Something about her narrative choices, favored themes, and prose style just doesn't quite work for me. With the latter specifically, it strangely feels like it should, even that it will, until the last minute when it veers into something that just does not. For whatever reason. Now moving on to something more positive, the first novel-length story I finished in April was Lev Grossman's The Magician King, the second book in his The Magician's trilogy, the first installment of which is an all-time fancy favourite I acquired last year, and I'm happy to report I thoroughly enjoyed this sequel as well, which is why I bothered to purchase a physical copy of it. I loved, once again, the dark, whimsical, and nerdy humour, replete with fancy culture references, is what I'm going to call them, allusions to and riffs on the likes of Harry Potter, or rather more, here specifically, the Chronicles of Narnia. I vibed yet again with the mixture of moderately advanced and more urban or internet-derived vocabulary that characterized the prose. I felt seen and understood by the maintained theming on the experience of difference, of the intellectually gifted and neurodivergent kind, fuck yes, and mental illness of the clinical depression variety, specifically sad, fuck yes this time, but also on the adjacent needs to find one's tribe, found family for the win big time in this one, one's place in the world, or the magical multiverse, as it were, and one's, well, inner peace in a way. Because of the Magician King, I also have a new, same-sex literary crush. God damn! I had related to Quentin and Alice a fair bit in book one, but that was nothing compared to the soul-sisterly feelings and, mild attraction I developed for goth nerd Aspie fucking Sumi, Witch Queen Julia. Unfortunately, I felt a chunk of her character arc was missing from the story and was left wanting a bit. Book two's conclusion feels bittersweet overall, and perhaps a tad rushed actually, though not ultimately undeservedly so, as Quentin's arc, conversely, felt entirely adequate and theming congruent to me, but not so with Julia. And that's also largely because of a major caveat to my enjoyment of the Magician King that I can't go into because of spoilers. So suffice it to say, an aspect of the plot and of Julia's character journey, which as an aside I interpreted as a pretty overt homage to the secret history, and I mean that also kind of goes for book one really, given its somewhat dark academia flavoring, so that element felt distastefully problematic to me, I'm afraid. I am not a squeamish reader by any means, but after thinking long and hard about it and discussing this element with a friend, I do believe it was unwarranted, poorly handled at the very least, and an example of, yeah, hashtag men writing women content. You can check out my Goodreads review if you want to know what it is precisely, but yeah, I can't say anything more because it would be spoiling a major plot twist, plot development of this book. This caveat undoubtedly impacted my final rating, that's that, but I still found plenty to love in this book. I am most definitely glad I read it, yes, and thus correspondingly rated it with a very solid 8 out of 10. Still, hashtag justice for Julia, hashtag that was not okay, and hashtag I love Julia. Also, I really should get back into the TV show adaptation, honestly, because I had enjoyed the beginning bits of it, and you know, I just enjoy this world enough that I want to stay a bit longer in it, so why not do it through a TV show adaptation? After that, I read The Enchanted, written by Rene Denfeld. This is a book I was recommended and gifted by a friend. Once again, thank you. You know who you are. And which has unexpectedly become a soft new general fiction favorite of mine. In fact, it was a last-minute addition to my top 10 all-time general fiction favorites list video I uploaded last month as well. The story of The Enchanted takes place in and around a male prison in the United States, and more or less centers on a female investigator whose job is to gather evidence that will allow defense attorneys to take inmates off of death row and back into life imprisonment, not back to freedom, as the vast majority of the so-called ladies' clients are in fact guilty of their often horrific crimes. However, the story is narrated by an inexplicably omniscient and unnamed inmate, at least at first, who calls the prison an enchanted place. You could technically argue there is a dash of magical realism present in this tale, but it is otherwise general fiction, in my opinion. I did a dedicated book review for this one, which you are welcome to check out, and will simply state here that I was pleasantly surprised, given its rather dark subject matter, by the novel's gentle, is what I called it, and light-filled prose, and more significantly than that, really impressed by the depth and subtlety of the book's theming on the value society places on life, death, justice, on the cycle of violence and violent crime, and on the multifaceted impact of trauma, to put it simply, on the human soul or heart. This was a quietly powerful and hard-hitting tale that I rated with a solid 7.5 out of 10, and that I would very highly recommend, provided you can handle the difficult, and yes, often distressing, but never gratuitously so, nature of its contents. In April, I also read The Gate to Women's Country, written by Sheri S. Tepper. This is a classic of the feminist SFF canon, available as you can see in the SF Masterwares collection, I first read in 2018, and which I now appreciate all the more for having reread it. So The Gate to Women's Country is a post-apocalyptic and light science fiction tale that features a matrifocal society somewhere in future North America that rose out of the ashes of a nuclear apocalypse, to put it simply. Women live in towns or small cities that form the titular women's country, carry out most of the activities one associates with civilization, and nominally hold all of the administrative and political power. Some men, called servitors, live among them, but most of the males born in women's country leave as boys at the age of 5 to grow up among the military garrisons posted outside of it and become soldiers. Said male garrisons are loosely modelled off of the martial cultures of the ancient Greco-Romans, and the ancient, fictional, once again I'm pretty sure, Greek satirical play Iphigenia at Ilium, referenced numerous times throughout the story, serves as a narrative backdrop to expand and sustain a large part of the book's feminist theming as well. Yes, indeed, and as already stated, The Gate to Women's Country is a rock-solid and unapologetic example of classic and/or second-wave feminist SFF literature, and I both love and respect it as such. Its world-building, as far as I'm concerned, is convincingly immersive, and its theming, this book has properly engaging and intelligent theming. I love to see it, and is most definitely an ideas-driven overall, yes, but in a way I found satisfyingly balanced as well. In fact, I felt a lot more emotionally impacted by the story this time round, which was a very nice surprise. And I'll leave off here, as I also recently did a dedicated book review for The Gate to Women's Country. As a quick little aside, I also have a dual book review for Sheri S. Tepper's Brass and Raising the Stones, all of which you are warmly welcome to check out if you want to hear me elaborate upon, well, this book at least, qualities, limitations, yes, themes, etc. All I'll add here is that I rated this one with an 8, too soft 8.5 out of 10, and thus still consider it a soft science fiction and or post-apocalyptic fiction, certainly feminist SFF fiction, favorite of mine. Finally, the last book I read in April was Sally Rooney's Conversations with Friends, and I actually kind of really liked it. You'll know at this point, presumably, my regulars at least, that Sally Rooney's Normal People, which I shall always affectionately refer to as this bitch, because of a basket case, is a top general fiction favorite of mine that absolutely wrecked my poor little romantic heart, always with a capital R, don't get it twisted. But I expected it to be a one-hit wonder of sorts, and only bought Rooney's other 2 novels because they were kind of just there, sitting pretty as it were, when I was doing my bookshop rounds in London last September. But lo and behold, yeah, I actually like this one. The actual fuck. So, to keep it rather brief, Conversations with Friends is a story about relationships, centered on a group of 4 characters. Frances and Bobby, the ex who is still her best friend, on the one hand, Nick and his wife Melissa on the other. All, but especially Frances and Nick, become increasingly entangled as the story progresses, and all of it is told through Frances' sole point of view. This book, similarly to Normal People, is all about character, really, and even more so character relationships. Oh yes, there isn't much in the way of plot. There isn't much overtly in the way of theming, though there were several, to me, jointly thought and emotion-provoking moments in the story. I find Rooney's prose quite sparse. I called it angular, I believe, in my review of Normal People, and I do feel she's improved since this one. I mean, it was her very first published novel, so, you know, that makes sense. But I mean, regardless, something about her prose just keeps me reading rather effortlessly, and that's kind of nice. It also seems there's a certain pattern or repeated template when it comes to her female MCs. Not that I mind at all. And of course, you know, this is only based on a so far rather small sample size of 2. I didn't relate nearly as much to Frances as I did to Marianne. Love Marianne. But there was definitely something there that struck a sensitive chord. I also really liked the ending because it just felt absolutely right to me, and I will always stand a rock-solid ending. Beyond that, I'm at a bit of a loss to express what I experienced here with this. Now, full disclosure, I was in a really weird, and by weird I mean rather depressed, grieving, lonely, touch-starved, the huge mood and headspace when I read this. Cried more than a fair bit, to be honest, and just felt like my heart was bruising. Strange mirroring of my experience reading Normal People for the first time there, I'll admit, though going through conversations with friends didn't wreck me like Normal People did. Thankfully, like, I couldn't have taken a second serving of that. Honestly, just kudos to this book. And Rooney's writing. Yeah, because to reiterate, I didn't expect anything from this. I still find Normal People the superior work, but I truly did not think Conversations with Friends would score above, what, a 5 to 6 out of 10 at maximum? And I was wrong, as I rated this with a 6.5 to a soft 7 out of 10. That's good. So now I'm just really curious to see what I'll make of Beautiful World, Where Are You? This coming month. I'm bloody surprised here. To add in a little bit of cinema related commentary, I guess, but I mean just a teensy bit of it. I did finally finish the first season of the Last of Us TV show, and I thought it was really good. It was solid TV, solid fungal shenanigans, so that's an automatic win in a way for me. I have not played the video game. That being said, from the little bit I know of the video game's plot and characters, I do believe it was a very good adaptation, so I'm genuinely glad for all you fans of the video game. Yay! On a much more humorous and silly note, I also watched the movie adaptation of Super Mario Brothers the game. And yeah, it was just a good time. Fun fact, my mother has also played some of the Mario games on our erstwhile Nintendo DS. I can't remember what model it was. So yeah, we both had a good time watching this, but it's just so freaking silly. I'm glad that the movie stuck to that just general vibe of silliness and didn't take itself too seriously. I think it's probably a movie that would be fun to watch as a family with kids, but I think it's also specifically fun for fans of the Nintendo games because there are lots of just little nods, references. Obviously, I mean, it's adapting the material, but yeah. I had a good time. It was cute. Kind of like the Angry Birds movie, which I also liked. And I'm so happy and relieved to report that there was, in fact, a boo in the movie because I really wanted to see a boo. I love the boos in those games. I don't know why, but the whole, like, oh, I'm hiding my face, and then I look at you when your back is turned to me thing for little freaking ghosts. I love that, okay, still me. So there was a boo. Yay! Also, as a reminder, I'm quite happy and satisfied that I uploaded all 5 of my top 10 favorites or anti-favorites lists of videos last month, and you know, I warmly invite you to check those out if you haven't already. And this coming month, well, like I already said, I'm going to read Sally Rooney's 3rd published novel, so Beautiful World, Where Are You? I will be rereading Wuthering Heights, I will be reading Sunshine and Medieval, yes, and I will also be rereading Marge Piercy's Women on the Edge of Time, so I can do a review for that one as well. And on that very final note, I hope you had a good month of April, reading and otherwise, and I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all reasonably soon-ish in another video. But until then, bye-bye.